My name is Regina Warren. I raised my son Joshua for 22 years in a 2-bedroom apartment in Indianapolis. I worked double shifts at a diner, helped him with his homework at midnight, and held him when the world was too heavy. And on the night of his wedding, they sat me at table 14, in the back, behind a pillar. That's not the worst part. The worst part is what I overheard right before the toasts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. The invitation arrived 3 weeks after everyone else's. I know because Joshua's college roommate posted his on Instagram in January. Mine showed up in February. No call, no explanation. Just a cream-colored envelope with my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Mrs. Regina Warren. Not Mom, not even Regina. Mrs., like I was a vendor. I ironed my best blouse the morning of the wedding, burgundy. I bought it on clearance 2 winters ago and saved it for something worth wearing it to. I figured my son's wedding qualified. I drove 2 hours from my apartment on the east side of Indianapolis to the Grand View Hotel downtown, the kind of place that charges $40 for parking and expects you to smile about it. The lobby smelled like money, orchids everywhere, marble floors, a string quartet playing something I couldn't name but knew cost a fortune. That's when I saw them. Jimmy Warren, my ex-husband, 57 years old, silver at the temples, wearing a tuxedo that fit him the way a tuxedo only fits a man who's been measured for one before. Beside him stood Mandy Reynolds, now Mandy Warren, 41, highlighted hair, the kind of smile that's been practiced in a mirror so long it looks natural. She had one hand on Joshua's arm and the other around a flute of champagne, and she was laughing at something Jimmy said like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. I'd never met Mandy in person, but I knew her name. I'd known it since Joshua was 17 and stopped spending weekends with me. I joined the line to greet them. Jimmy's handshake was brief, firm, the handshake of a man who wants you to feel managed. Regina, that's all he said. Not, so glad you came, not, you look great, just my name like a checkbox. Mandy was warmer, which was somehow worse. We're so happy you could make it, she said, and touched my arm like we were friends. It means so much to Joshua. I looked for Joshua's eyes in that moment. He was already being pulled toward someone else, his new father-in-law, a big man in a loud tie. He glanced back at me for a half-second, a small wave, then he was gone. The wedding coordinator, a woman named Rita with a headset and a clipboard, found me near the entrance. "You're Joshua's mother?" I said. "I am." "Wonderful." She made a small mark. "You'll be at table 14, just past the floral arch near the east wall." I followed the seating cards until I found mine. A round table tucked behind a pillar so wide it blocked the view of the altar entirely. My table companions were a great uncle with a hearing aid and 2 of Jimmy's cousins I'd never met. One of them looked at me when I sat down and said, "Are you from Mandy's side?" I said, "No, I'm Joshua's mother." She blinked, said, "Oh," and turned back to her salad. Then came the family photos. The coordinator gathered everyone. "Immediate family," she called out. Jimmy and Mandy stepped forward without hesitation. Joshua and his new bride, Megan, stood between them, and Megan's parents flanked the outside. The photographer adjusted the frame. Someone handed Mandy a bouquet. I stepped toward the group. Rita appeared at my elbow, gentle, professional, apologetic in a way that required no apology to be spoken. "We're keeping the formal portraits to the core family unit," she said quietly, "but we'll absolutely get a photo of you and Joshua later in the evening." Core family unit. I stepped back. The camera clicked. Jimmy's arm went around Joshua's shoulders, and Mandy leaned in just enough to make sure she was centered. I stood behind the pillar and watched my son smile for a photo I wasn't in. I went back to table 14 and unfolded my napkin. I'd brought Joshua a gift. Nothing expensive. I couldn't afford expensive. I'd spent 4 months building him a memory book, photographs, handwritten notes, ticket stubs from every school play and little league game I'd dragged to after double shifts. I'd printed and laminated each page myself. The cover read, "Everything I watched you become." I'd set it on the gift table near the entrance. By the time I passed it on the way to my seat, someone had moved it to the end of the table, behind the Tiffany bags, behind the envelopes fat with checks. I sat at table 14, behind the pillar, in my clearance blouse, and I waited. But then, halfway through the salad course, I heard something from the table just beside the floral arch. Jimmy's voice, low and certain, carrying the way it always had. And what he said stopped the air in my lungs. I almost didn't go. I'd been sitting at table 14 for 40 minutes, picking at a salad I didn't taste, when I decided I needed a moment away from the noise, away from Jimmy's laughter carrying across the room like he owned the walls, away from Mandy adjusting the centerpiece at the head table like she'd arranged the whole world to her liking. I slipped out through the side door into the corridor. It was quieter out there. Marble floors, low lighting, the muffled sound of the string quartet seeping through the walls. I was heading toward the restroom when I heard voices coming from the alcove near the coat check, a little recessed sitting area with 2 velvet chairs on a small table, the kind of spot designed for private conversations. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I know Jimmy's voice the way you know a storm coming, by feel before you ever hear the thunder. I stopped beside the wall and stayed still. Jimmy was sitting with his business partner, a man named Jerry who'd been his college roommate and apparently his moral compass for 30 years, which explained a lot. Mandy was beside him, champagne in hand, her heels crossed at the ankle like she was posing for a magazine. "She looked lost out there," Jerry was saying. He sounded almost amused. "She always does. That's Regina. She doesn't know how to exist in a room like this." Mandy laughed, soft, controlled, the kind of laugh designed to sound generous. I almost felt bad for her during the photos. Almost. "She'll be fine," Jimmy said. "She's used to the background." I pressed my back against the marble. My hands were flat against the concrete, cold. "Does Joshua know," Jerry asked, "about the toast?" "He knows the program," Jimmy said. "Rita handled it. We kept the list tight. Me, the best man, the maid of honor. That's it." "And Regina wasn't asked." Jimmy's voice was even, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing a budget line. "Look, she did what she could with what she had. Nobody's disputing that. But tonight is about the life Joshua is stepping into, not the one he came from." The life he came from. I had to press my lips together from making a sound. "She brought a scrapbook," Mandy said. I could hear the smile in it. "A handmade scrapbook with stickers, I think?" "Of course she did," Jerry said and chuckled. "She means well." Mandy's voice softened into something that sounded like pity but wore kindness like a costume. But you can't compete with what Jimmy's given that boy, the education, the network, the foundation. You can't put that in a scrapbook. Foundation. I thought about the word, about the foundation of our apartment on Ritter Avenue, where the heat cut out every February, and I'd pile extra blankets on Joshua's bed and tell him we were camping indoors, where I'd sat with him at the kitchen table until 11 at night, drilling him on algebra because the tutor Jimmy promised to pay for never materialized. That was a foundation, too. It just didn't photograph well. Jimmy leaned back. I could hear the shift of his chair. The truth is, Joshua outgrew that chapter of his life a long time ago. Mandy gave him a different model, a different standard. He sees that. He appreciates it, and tonight should reflect the life he's built, not where he started. Where he started? Like I was a neighborhood he'd moved out of. Besides, Mandy added, we made sure he had everything he needed for today. The rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon, the deposit for their new place. We took care of it. You did, Jerry agreed. So, Jimmy's glass clinked down on the table. Tonight belongs to that. I stood in the corridor a moment longer. The quartet started up again inside. A waltz, something sweeping and expensive. I thought about walking back in and pretending I hadn't heard any of it, sitting at table 14, finishing my salad, smiling at the great uncle with the hearing aid, being gracious, being invisible, being what they'd decided I was. Instead, I walked back toward the ballroom doors and paused with my hand on the brass handle. Because through the small window in the door, I could see the gift table. My memory book was still there, pushed to the far end, half behind a large silver bag with a white satin bow. And I could see Joshua. He was standing near the head table, laughing with one of his groomsmen, straightening his tie. Happy, handsome, 28 years old, and completely unaware that 40 feet away in a marble corridor, his mother had just heard herself described as a chapter he'd outgrown. I watched him for a moment, and then I noticed something. He'd broken away from the groomsmen. He was walking, not toward the dance floor, not toward the bar, but toward the gift table. He stopped in front of it. His eyes moved across the bags and boxes, and then they landed on my memory book, pushed to the far end, half hidden behind silver paper. He picked it up. He looked at the cover. Everything I watched you become. In the expression on his face, I couldn't read it from where I was standing. But then Mandy appeared at his side, said something close to his ear, and he set the book back down and walked away with her. I've watched a lot of things in my life that hurt. I watched Jimmy pack his bags on a Tuesday morning while Joshua was at school so he wouldn't have to explain it to a 9-year-old. I watched the lights get shut off on a December night and told Joshua it was an adventure. I watched my own mother's funeral from the front pew alone because Jimmy had a conference call he couldn't reschedule. But I have never in my life felt pain the way I felt it sitting at table 14 watching Jimmy Warren take the microphone. He didn't rush to it. Men like Jimmy never rush. They wait until the room comes to them. Rita, the coordinator, had dimmed the lights slightly. The DJ handed over the mic with both hands like he was presenting something sacred. Jimmy buttoned his jacket, the way men do when they want you to notice the jacket, and he smiled out at the room. "I'll keep this short," he said. He did not keep it short. 28 years ago, a boy came into my life who I knew was going to do something remarkable. He paused, let it land. I watched him grow into a man of discipline, of focus, of integrity, and I want everyone in this room to know that doesn't happen by accident. Applause, real applause, the kind that fills a room. Jimmy looked at Joshua with the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed humility until it looks genuine. Son, you became who you are because you had a standard in front of you. You had a home where excellence wasn't optional, where showing up mattered, where the people around you demanded the best from you and gave it in return. He raised his glass toward Mandy. And a lot of that credit goes to this woman right here who stepped into your life and showed you what a real partnership looks like. Mandy pressed her hand to her chest, smiled, looked at Joshua with wet eyes. The room erupted. I held my water glass with both hands and said nothing. Jerry stood next, clapping Jimmy on the back as they traded places. He told a story about Joshua interning at Jimmy's firm 4 summers ago, how focused he was, how professional, how much Jimmy had shaped him. Then the best man, then the maid of honor, who cried through most of it and made the whole room cry with her. And then Rita glanced at her clipboard, made a small check, and nodded to the DJ. No mother's blessing. I hadn't been on the list. I found out later, not from Joshua, not from Rita, but from the great uncle at my table who leaned over and said in a loud whisper, "Didn't you want to say something, dear?" That there had been a mother's blessing on the original program. Rita had told me as much in the foyer before dinner. Just a few words, traditional. Jimmy pulled it, told Rita the program was running long, streamlined, he'd called it. I smiled at the great uncle and said, "I'll find another moment." I don't know why I said that. I didn't believe it. Across the room, Joshua was standing with Megan, their foreheads almost touching, her laughing at something he'd whispered. He looked so happy, and that happiness looked so complete that I wondered, sitting there behind my pillar, whether there was any room in it for me. Then the dancing started. The DJ invited the parents to the floor for a special dance. Mandy and Jimmy walked out immediately. Megan's parents followed. The photographer circled them, flashbulb going, catching every angle. Rita's eyes found me for 1 second, then moved away. I stayed in my seat. I watched my ex-husband dance with my son at my son's wedding. Mandy's head rested on Jimmy's shoulder. Joshua twirled Megan under the chandelier light, and when he spun her out, he caught Jimmy's eye and grinned, the easy grin of a man who feels held by the people around him. I turned and looked at the gift table. My memory book was where Mandy had left it, pushed to the back, half behind the silver bag. But something was different now. It had been moved slightly. The cover was facing outward, like someone had picked it up and set it back down in a hurry, or like someone had started to open it and stopped. I looked back at the dance floor. Joshua was still dancing. Megan caught my eye from over his shoulder. She smiled at me, gracious, warm, the smile of a woman who has already won and wants you to know she's not gloating. I smiled back. The song ended. The room applauded. Jimmy took a small bow. And that's when I saw Joshua break away from the group and walk quietly, without telling anyone, back toward the gift table. He didn't pick up the Tiffany bag. He didn't reach for the envelope from Jimmy's law partner. He picked up my memory book. He stood with his back half to the room, and he opened it, and he didn't close it. I almost didn't watch. Part of me wanted to look away, the way you look away from something that might hurt you less if you don't see it directly, like staring at an eclipse, like reading a letter you're not sure you want the answer to. But I couldn't stop watching my son. Joshua stood at the far end of the gift table with his back half to the room. His tuxedo jacket was slightly creased at the shoulders now, the way it gets when a man has been hugged enough times that the fabric remembers it. He had the memory book open in both hands, and he was still, completely still. In a room full of movement and noise and champagne and laughter, my son was standing perfectly still. I watched him turn a page. I knew what was on that page. I'd spent 4 months building it. I knew every photograph I'd chosen, every note I'd written in the margins, every ticket stub I'd laminated with shaking hands at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning because I worked late and that was the only quiet time I had. Page 1 was a photograph of Joshua at age 4, sitting on the counter of our apartment kitchen in his pajamas, helping me make pancakes, flour on his nose, both of us laughing. I'd written underneath it in black pen, "The first thing I ever taught you was that making a mess is part of making something good." Page 3 was his first grade report card, all C's and 1 B. I'd written, "You cried over this." I didn't, because I knew something you didn't yet, that where you start is never where you finish. Page 7 was a photograph from his 8th grade science fair. He'd built a model of the solar system out of styrofoam balls and wire hangers and lost to a kid whose dad had clearly built his project for him. Joshua came home furious. I'd written under the photo, "You said it wasn't fair. I said you were right. Then I said, do it again next year and make them question themselves. You did. You won." Page 11 was a hospital bracelet. The night Joshua was 17 and got appendicitis at 2 in the morning, and I drove him to Methodist Hospital in my pajamas with no gas money and charged the copay on a credit card I was already behind on. I'd written, "I was terrified that night. I didn't show you. That's also something I taught you, how to be scared and steady at the same time." I knew every page. I knew what he was reading, and I watched his shoulders do something I hadn't seen them do since he was a teenager. They dropped. Not with defeat, with the peculiar heaviness of someone being reminded of something they'd been trying not to think about. He turned another page, then another. He wasn't rushing. The dancing was still going behind him. The DJ had moved into something faster, something loud, and half the room was on the floor. Nobody was watching Joshua except me. He got to the last page. I knew what was there. I'd written it 3 times before I got the words right. "Joshua, I am not the parent who gave you the most. I know that, but I want you to know what I gave you was everything I had. Every shift, every late night, every choice I made when the choices were hard. You were always the reason. You will always be the reason. I don't need credit. I just need you to know. Mom." He closed the book. He stood there with it pressed against his chest, both arms wrapped around it, the way he used to hold things he didn't want to put down when he was small. A favorite book, a stuffed bear he pretended he was too old for. Then he turned around, and his eyes found me immediately, across the whole ballroom, through the moving bodies and the chandelier light and the noise. He found me sitting behind my pillar at table 14 in my burgundy blouse. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Joshua took a step toward me, and Jimmy appeared at his shoulder. I couldn't hear what Jimmy said. The music was too loud, but I watched his hand come down on Joshua's arm, firm, directional, the same hand that had signed the checks and made the calls and built the version of Joshua's story that didn't include me. Joshua looked at Jimmy. Then he looked back at me, and something shifted in his face that I can only describe as a decision being made. He said something to Jimmy, short, 2, maybe 3 words. Jimmy's expression didn't change on the surface, but his hand dropped. Joshua crossed the ballroom floor. He didn't rush. He walked the way a man walks when he's sure where he's going. past the dance floor, past the bar, past Mandy, who clocked him from across the room and started to follow before something stopped her. Maybe the set of his shoulders, maybe some instinct that told her this was not a moment she could redirect. He stopped in front of me. He was still holding the book. "Mom," his voice was quiet, just for me. "I need to ask you something." I looked up at him. "Okay. Did you make every page of this yourself?" "I did." He swallowed. "The hospital bracelet. Methodist, 2013. You had a fever of 103 and you kept apologizing for waking me up." I paused. "You never had to apologize for that." His jaw tightened, not with anger, with something that was trying to become something else. "I didn't know you still had that," he said. "I kept everything." He looked down at the book, then back at me, and I saw it, the thing I'd been waiting for all night without knowing it. Not an apology, not an explanation, just recognition. The look of a person who has suddenly seen something clearly they'd been looking at sideways for years. "I need to do something," he said. "Joshua, I need everyone in this room to know. You don't have to. Joshua," he said it firmly, gently, the way I used to say his name when he was about to talk himself out of something true. "I do." He straightened, looked across the room toward the DJ booth. His jaw was set. I reached out and put my hand on his arm. "Whatever you're about to do," I said, "make sure you're doing it for the right reason. Not for me, not against him, for you." He looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded once, and he walked toward the DJ. The music cut out mid-song. People looked up from their drinks. Conversations dropped off in pieces, the way sound dies in a room when something shifts the air. The DJ stepped back from the booth with his hands raised slightly, the look of a man who had just been relieved of his microphone by someone he wasn't going to argue with. Joshua stood at the front of the ballroom. He didn't have a spotlight. He didn't need one. He had the stillness of a man who had made a decision and was no longer negotiating with it. He held the memory book in one hand and the microphone in the other, and he waited until the room was completely quiet. Jimmy was at the bar. I watched his glass stop halfway to his mouth. Mandy was near the floral arch. Her smile stayed on, but her eyes went careful, calculating, the smile of someone who is still deciding whether this is a problem. Megan stood near the head table, her bouquet in her hands, watching her husband with an expression I couldn't fully read from where I sat, but she didn't move to stop him. Joshua spoke. "I want to tell you all something, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me for a few minutes, because I've been trying to say this for a long time, and I keep finding reasons not to." The room waited. "Tonight, I opened a gift." He held up the memory book. "And I almost didn't. I almost set it aside the way, honestly, the way I've been setting aside a lot of things that came from my mother for the last several years, because I got comfortable with a version of my own story that was easier, that was cleaner, that gave credit where credit looked good." Jimmy set his glass down. "My dad gave a toast tonight about discipline and foundation and the environment that shaped me." Joshua's voice was even, careful. He wasn't performing anger. He was doing something harder than that. He was telling the truth in front of people who had agreed on a different version of it. "Dad, you paid for this wedding. You paid for my last 2 years of college. You built me a network I've used, and I'm grateful for that. I mean it." A beat. "But that's not the same thing as building me." The room was so quiet I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass. Joshua opened the memory book. Page 1. I'm 4 years old. I'm standing on a kitchen counter in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Indianapolis, making pancakes with my mother at 7 in the morning before she drove me to daycare and went to work a double shift. He looked up. She wrote underneath it, "Making a mess is part of making something good." I have used that exact idea in every job I have ever had. I have said those words in meetings. I didn't know where they came from until tonight. Someone near the front started to say something, stopped. Page 7. I lost a science fair to a kid whose father built his project for him. I came home furious. My mother didn't tell me life was fair. She told me I was right that it wasn't, and then she told me to do it again the next year and make them question themselves. He paused. I won the next year. I've been doing that ever since. I pressed my hands flat on the table. Page 11. His voice dropped slightly. A hospital bracelet. I was 17, appendicitis, 2 in the morning. My mother drove me to Methodist Hospital in her pajamas with $40 in her account and charged the copay on a credit card she was already behind on. She sat in that waiting room for 6 hours, and when I apologized for waking her up, she looked at me like I'd said something in a foreign language. He stopped, cleared his throat. I have never once in my adult life made the people I love feel like a burden. I learned that from her, from that night, from the look on her face. The silence in the room had changed texture. It wasn't the silence of people being polite. It was the silence of people holding their breath. My mother's name is Regina Warren. She worked doubles at a diner for 11 years. She helped me with algebra at midnight. She kept every report card, every ticket stub, every hospital bracelet, every small thing that I forgot mattered. His voice was steady, but I could hear what it was costing him. For the last several years, I have let her sit in the back of my life the same way she sat at table 14 tonight, behind a pillar, off the program, out of the frame. He looked directly at me. "Mom, I'm sorry." 2 words, but they landed like something that had been held in a long time, finally being set down. "I'm sorry I let anyone make you feel like a footnote in a story you wrote. I'm sorry it took me until tonight to say out loud what I have always known, that everything people have been praising me for tonight, the discipline, the resilience, the way I show up, that was you. You built that, in a 2-bedroom apartment with a broken heater and $40 and a lot of pancakes." He closed the book. Regina Warren built that. The applause started slowly, 1 person, then 3, then the whole room coming to its feet in sections, the way applause does when it's real and not rehearsed, not polite clapping, the kind that fills the chest cavity, the kind that sounds like something being corrected. I didn't stand up. I couldn't. My legs weren't working right. Joshua crossed the room. He handed me the memory book, and then he pulled me into a hug. Not the brief, careful hug of a grown man at a formal event, but the full hug of a person who had just remembered something important about who they are and where they came from. He held on. I let him. When he pulled back, Megan was standing beside him. She put her hand over mine on the memory book and said, quietly and without performance, "I want to learn everything in this. I mean it." I looked at my son's wife, and I believed her. Jimmy left 20 minutes later. I didn't watch him go. I heard it from the great uncle at table 14 who patted my hand and said, "His loss, dear," which was the kindest and most accurate thing anyone said to me all evening. Mandy lingered longer, recalibrating. She made 1 pass toward Joshua near the end of the night, touched his arm, said something with her gracious smile. He nodded, polite, distant, the way you are with someone you've just reclassified. I sat at my table and let people come to me. And they did. Joshua's friends, Megan's parents, who turned out to be warm, plain-spoken people from Columbus who shook my hand and said they'd heard wonderful things about me, which surprised me until Megan told me later she'd been saying them for years. A woman from Table 9 who I'd never met who pressed her card in my hand and said, "My mother went through something like this. Thank you for staying." I hadn't thought of it as brave staying, but maybe it was. At the end of the night, when the staff was breaking down the centerpieces and the last guests were calling their cars, Joshua found me in the lobby. He was carrying the memory book. "Can I keep this?" he asked. "It's yours. It always was." He nodded, looked at the cover one more time. Then he looked at me with the particular expression of a man who is not done with a conversation, but is willing to take it slowly. "Can we have breakfast next week? Just us?" "I'd like that." "I want to hear the stories, the ones behind the photos." He paused. "I feel like I missed a lot." "You didn't miss it. It's all still there. It was always going to be there when you were ready." He hugged me again at the door. Then I walked out through the lobby, past the orchids and the marble and the $40 parking, and out into the Indianapolis night air. I drove home in my clearance blouse with the windows down. I didn't need to play the evening back in my head. I didn't need to rehearse what had happened or what it meant or whether it was enough. My son knew my name. He'd said it out loud, in front of everyone, in a room full of people who had decided I didn't matter. Regina Warren built that. That was enough. That was everything. Some foundations take years to be recognized, but they never stop holding the weight. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if your own mother has been the quiet foundation nobody thanked, drop her name in the comments. She deserves to be seen. Subscribe for more stories like this one. We're just getting started.